Upon realizing his arranged husband seemingly kept someone else in his heart, Charles laid his cards on the table. From now on, we live our own lives. We won't interfere with each other. Garfield's deep eyes instantly darkened with a breathtaking intensity. You can certainly try. That very night, the heavy door of the club's VIP booth was swept open with an undeniable presence. His face set in a mask of intense focus, Garfield effortlessly scooped a stunned Charles into his arms, carrying him away right in front of the entire crowd. The massive king-sized bed in the master bedroom dipped deeply under their weight. The tall man slowly, methodically loosened his dark tie, completely enveloped by the irresistible, overwhelming magnetism of that dominant aura. A striking, delicate flush bloomed at the corners of Charles' eyes. His deepest, most instinctual longing was helplessly drawn to the surface by that absolute presence. Desperately clutching the edge of the blanket, his voice trembled as he asked, "Didn't we agree to live our own lives?" Garfield's scorching lips brushed against the soft shell of his ear, letting out a low, husky chuckle that sent a beautiful, melting shiver straight down Charles' spine. "We are living our own lives, baby." The man's voice was a profound, intoxicating whisper. "It's just that. My entire life is you." Main text. Rumors swirled through their elite circle like scattered confetti in the wind. Everyone's eyes were fixed on the gold, embossed wedding invitations, fully expecting Garfield, the notoriously rebellious heir to the Walton family, to stage a spectacular scene for the sake of his long-held childhood crush. Yet the lavish wedding ceremony left the guests in stunned silence. Charles sat quietly in the lounge, his pale fingertips dusted with mustard, yellow paint as he focused entirely on his canvas. An arranged marriage? A union in name only? It didn't matter. As long as he had his easel, he was in his own perfect world. That is, until Garfield pushed open the door. The warm golden light from the wall sconces spilled over the collar of Charles' fuzzy beige sweater. He looked up, the tall, broad-shouldered silhouette of the man reflecting in his clear, innocent eyes. Charles' tone was as light and breezy as if he were discussing the weather. "Since this is just a business arrangement, we can simply live our own lives in private. That way, when we eventually agree to a divorce, it won't be too awkward for either of us." Before the words even left his lips, the very atmosphere in the room shifted. The once soft glow of the lamps seemed to dim, edged with a deep, magnetic midnight blue. The air grew suddenly cool and electric. Garfield stepped closer, his towering presence casting a long, undeniable shadow that enveloped Charles in an overwhelming intensity. The man's jaw was clenched tight in the low light, a deep, turbulent tide swirling in his dark eyes. His gaze locked onto Charles' unguarded expression, and when he spoke, his voice was a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to resonate from deep within his chest. "Divorce? Live our own lives?" For the rest of the evening, a cool, frost-kissed aura lingered around Garfield, a quiet magnetism that kept them on opposite shores of a heavy silence. On their first night as a married couple, Charles sank into the massive king-sized bed, his soft, short hair still damp from the shower. His eyelids grew heavy, and he quickly drifted into a hazy slumber. He didn't know how much time had passed when the mattress beside him dipped slightly. A large, distinctively sculpted hand with slightly rough fingertips brushed gently through his hair, the comforting warmth of a palm cradling the back of his neck. A dry, incredibly soft towel was wrapped around his damp locks, drying them with slow heart-melting patience. At the same time, a breathtaking luminescence began to bloom in the dimly lit bedroom. Flecks of warm amber light floated into existence, like fireflies dancing in a summer forest, or dappled golden sunbeams filtering through the canopy of ancient pines. This tangible, soft orange glow wrapped around Charles in an embrace of overwhelming tenderness, chasing away every chill of the night. Bathed in this visible, comforting warmth, the tension completely melted from Charles' shoulders. The corners of his mouth curved into a deeply peaceful smile as he fell into a profound, restful sleep. Bright morning sunlight filled the room. The only sign of Garfield was the faint indentations left on the other side of the bed. Downstairs, the elderly butler brought out steaming soup dumplings and a fragrant bowl of shrimp dumpling noodles. The young master left for the office early this morning. Before he stepped out, he specifically instructed the kitchen to prepare your favorite traditional breakfast. Charles took a bite of a savory golden dumpling, his cheeks puffing out adorably like a foraging hamster. Glancing around the empty, luxurious dining room, his eyes sparkled with the delight of what he thought was a flawlessly hands-off marriage. However, just as he patted his perfectly full stomach and let out a tiny, contented burp, the screen of the butler's phone, left resting on the sunlit table, suddenly lit up. The name Garfield was flashing insistently across the screen. Seeing that the call was about to go to voicemail, Charles panicked. He reached out, his fingertips trembling slightly as he swiped to answer. "Uncle Bob, is Charles awake yet?" The man's voice coming through the speaker was a rich, low baritone, laced with a soft magnetism, and that signature morning rasp. Charles froze. His thick eyelashes fluttered nervously, and a faint blush crept up to the tips of his ears, glowing translucent in the sunlight. "Ah, this is Charles." A breathless silence stretched between the two ends of the line. Charles gripped the tablecloth in a sudden wave of nerves, his knuckles turning pale. He could almost hear his own heart hammering wildly against his ribs. Finally, Garfield's voice broke the quiet. "I left a document in a white envelope on the study desk. I need it for my next meeting. Could you ask Uncle Bob to have the driver bring it over?" Charles subconsciously bit his lower lip. "Is it urgent? What if I bring it to you?" "It's not urgent." Garfield's tone instantly softened into an undeniable, tender purr, the deep vibration traveling through the receiver and brushing straight against Charles' eardrum. "You've looked exhausted these past few days. Just stay home and get a good rest today." Charles' cheeks immediately caught fire. His left hand mindlessly toyed with a white porcelain spoon on the table. "It's fine, I've slept enough. I actually wanted to go out for a bit." He paused, a sudden thought dimming the light in his eyes. Maybe Garfield didn't actually want to see him. Lowering his voice, he added quietly, "I'll just go find Uncle Bob. The document is on the study desk." Garfield cut him off smoothly, his husky voice carrying a profound, irresistible warmth. "I've already informed the front desk. When you arrive, come straight up." Charles hurried into Garfield's private elevator. The moment the metal doors slid shut, the lingering essence of the man's presence completely enveloped him. It was as if an invisible, ancient cedar tree was unfurling its magnificent branches, wrapping around his very breath in an inescapable, intoxicating embrace. Even with the thick scent, blocker patch resting at the nape of his neck, Charles' breathing fell completely out of rhythm. Fine beads of sweat gathered at his temples, slipping down his flushed cheeks. That radiant, amber glow, the undeniable signature of a dominant presence, seemed to gently yet fervently kiss his earlobes and fingertips, the sheer heat of it turning his legs to jelly. Ding! The second the elevator doors parted, Charles stumbled forward, falling straight into a broad, reassuringly warm embrace. Garfield caught him effortlessly by the waist. The man's pupils constricted the moment he took in Charles' flushed complexion. Charles didn't dare look up, caught between breathlessness and that gentle but irresistible presence. A striking, delicate flush had spread to the corners of his eyes. Garfield's jaw tightened. Without a single word, he scooped Charles up into his strong arms, carrying him with a steady stride right into the CEO's office. A glass of warm water was pressed into his hands, and a cool towel was swiftly but gently placed against his forehead. Seeing the deep furrow in the man's brow as he reached to call the private doctor, Charles hastily grabbed his large, sculpted hand. "I'm fine. I just need to lie down for a second. You go ahead and work. I understand what you're doing. Since the marriage, both our family's stocks have gone up, so we definitely need to act close to stabilize the market. But no one is watching right now, so you don't have to pretend." Garfield's movements came to a dead halt. He lowered his eyes, the corners of his lips curling into an incredibly chilly smile. When he finally looked up again, the warmth in his gaze had plummeted to absolute zero. "Stabilize the market, is it?" The man stood to his full height, looking down at him with a dark, breathtaking intensity. "Then I'll have to trouble you, Mr. Charles, to visit the office much more often, so we can put on a truly convincing show of our deep affection." Over the next month, Charles made a daily appearance at the office. The exquisite afternoon tea pastries, the gentle sweep of a paintbrush in the lounge, and the crisp clicking of a gaming controller wove into a vibrant daily routine. Whenever the wall clock struck 5, Garfield would punctually push open the door. Under the awe-struck gazes of the entire floor, he would interlock his fingers tightly with Charles, striding confidently toward the elevator. Riding alongside the upward, trending green curves of the NASDAQ, this flawless performance naturally spilled over into their evenings. The moment the dinner plates were cleared, Garfield would change into his casual shoes and stand quietly in the warm glow of the entryway, waiting with the steadfast devotion of a large, loyal hound. They strolled side by side down the streets, chasing the melting tangerine sunset at the end of the road and stepping over the swaying, elongated shadows cast by the street lamps. As the evening breeze brushed through Charles' soft hair, he would occasionally pause and glance back, his eyes unfailingly colliding with Garfield's deep, magnetic gaze. There were too many turbulent undercurrents swirling in those eyes, currents Charles couldn't quite decipher. Yet in the moment their eyes met, that intensity would melt into an overwhelmingly restrained tenderness. Surrounded by the warm orange hues of the twilight, Charles' heart would helplessly skip a beat. Until that fateful afternoon. Carrying a tiered, insulated lunchbox, Charles pushed open the office door just as he always did. Standing before the sun-dappled desk was an incredibly unfamiliar, slender silhouette. The man was dressed in an impeccably tailored, cool gray suit, his features sharp and striking. Hearing the door, the young man turned his head. A pair of dark, gleaming, yet entirely warmthless eyes swept over Charles with frigid indifference, as if he were nothing more than a passing breeze. Garfield, meanwhile, was looking at the young man's profile with a noticeable absence of his usual sharp edge, replaced by a rare, gentle patience. "Why are you here so early today?" Garfield stepped forward, his brow furrowing slightly, as his gaze landed on the lunchbox. "I'm sorry, an impromptu meeting with a partner came up for noon. I was just about to call you." "Mr. Garfield," the gray-suited young man's crisp voice dropped into the air like clinking ice cubes, flawlessly interrupting the conversation. "The client arrives in 20 minutes. It is time to leave." Charles didn't even have a chance to set the lunchbox down. He could only force a strained smile, waving his hand in a flustered motion as he watched the two men walk out side by side. Their retreating figures grew smaller at the end of the hallway. The hushed whispers of the assistants brushed past his ears. "That's Brent, the Omega the company sponsored all the way through school. He just got back from his studies in Europe." The CEO literally broke company protocol to recruit him back then. Charles stood frozen in place, the warmth from the lunchbox slowly slipping away through his fingertips. He lowered his eyes, biting down hard on his lower lip. The lingering twilight and the street lamp silhouettes that had once made him feel so warm suddenly felt like a fading silent film, the colors peeling away piece by piece until nothing was left but a lifeless ashen gray. It seemed. This Brent was the unforgettable presence Garfield had kept tucked away in his heart all these years. The warm, yellow overhead light spilled softly into the art studio, yet the canvas remained trapped in a dead, suffocating white. Charles gripped the paint, splattered palette, his fingertips unconsciously pressing down until his knuckles turned pale. A heavy, stifling weight pressed against his chest. Irritated, he tossed the paintbrush aside, lowering his eyelashes as he slowly trudged down the stairs. Beep, beep, beep. The crisp chime of the electronic lock shattered the quiet. Charles' footsteps abruptly halted, a flicker of anticipation, one he didn't even realize he was harboring, suddenly lighting up his dimmed eyes. However, the figure who pushed open the dark oak door was a silhouette of cold, rigid lines in gray, looking like a starkly drawn sketch. Stripped of any excess emotion, Brent's long legs carried him straight up the stairs. He skillfully pushed open the door to the master bedroom's walk-in closet, retrieved a pure black haute couture suit, and left without leaving a single glance behind. As the front door clicked shut again, the motion, sensor lights in the hallway extinguished one by one, stretching Charles' fragile shadow into a lonely, isolating length. That night, Garfield never came home, even long after Charles had finally fallen asleep. A long-negotiated overseas acquisition project for the Walton Group had suddenly hit a snag, and Garfield became unusually occupied. The days that followed were sliced into a chaotic montage of fast, forwarded scenes, the tightly shut frosted glass of the conference room, the blinking navigation lights of red-eye international flights, and the cold silhouette of Brent frequently weaving through the villa. Even on the rare occasions they sat at the same dining table, Garfield was always engaged in low-voiced conversations with Brent, trading obscure business jargon. The crystal chandelier above the dining table cast dappled pools of light. Charles bit down on his lower lip so hard it hurt, his knife and fork scraping against the porcelain plate with a piercing screech. He abruptly pushed his chair back, turned, and bolted for the stairs. Charles. A broad, searingly hot hand suddenly clamped down on his wrist. Garfield had chased after him. The man's deep eyes were laced with bloodshot veins, and the amber motes of light that subtly floated around him were vibrating rapidly in the air, betraying his deep anxiety. "I'm sorry." Give me a week, tops, and I'll have all of this sorted out. You don't need to report any of this to me. Charles didn't look back. His trembling voice was as cold as ice. We are just an arranged marriage. Companionship is not your obligation. The grip on his wrist instantly stiffened. The warm, dancing specks of amber light in the air seemed to be drained of their heat in a split second, solidifying into a dim, lifeless ash. Garfield's fiercely clenched jaw betrayed a silent, agonizing pain. He lowered his eyelashes in silence, and his 5 fingers slowly, agonizingly released Charles' wrist. A few afternoons later, the sunlight pierced through the floor to ceiling windows of the kitchen. The rich aroma of coffee, accompanied by soft, warm white steam, gently enveloped Charles. He pushed a plate of meticulously arranged, exquisite pastries and a steaming cup of coffee across the bar counter, a clumsy gesture of compromise and apology. However, Brent, standing on the opposite side, merely raised the corners of his eyes, his lips curling into an incredibly piercing, mocking smirk. Mr. Garfield gets stomach aches when he drinks coffee. Brent's frigid gaze scraped across Charles' stiffening face like a razor blade. What? Just because it's an arranged marriage, you didn't even know that? The warm white steam hovering over the counter seemed to instantly freeze. Charles' pupils contracted sharply. His fingernails dug fiercely into his palms, and whatever color remained in his pale face drained away completely. The scene cut abruptly to the dazzling neon-lit chaos of Dice Bar. A hazy, magenta neon glow filtered through the translucent crystal glass, refracting against Charles' heavily flushed cheeks. The intense bass vibrated against his eardrums as he clung tightly to a bottle of strong liquor. A striking, deeply aggrieved redness rimmed his eyes. He gets stomach aches? If he doesn't drink coffee, why did he specifically drag me out to buy an espresso machine? Is that entire cabinet of coffee beans just sitting there waiting to grow mold? Alan sighed, waving off the gorgeous male models trying to inch closer in the VIP booth. He stared into Charles' tear-filled eyes, his tone steady but piercing straight to the truth. Charles, weren't you practically begging to live separate lives before? Now that it's actually happening, why do you look like a child whose favorite candy just got snatched away? Could it be that you? The deafening roar of the speakers felt as if it had been instantly muted. The kaleidoscope of laser lights flashed wildly in Charles' suddenly dilated pupils. He stared blankly at the melting ice in his glass, his heart wildly and uncontrollably skipping a massive beat in that single second. He was falling for him. As if fleeing an approaching storm, Charles spent the next few nights hiding himself away in the deafening waves of sound at Dice Bar. He wouldn't sneak back into the silent villa until the dead of night, smelling faintly of alcohol, only to tuck himself away in the corner guest room. Until that night. Under the dim wall sconces of the hallway, Charles had just wrapped his fingers around the cold doorknob of the guest room when a towering, breathtakingly intense shadow loomed over him from behind. The air in the corridor suddenly grew thick and electric. Beneath the crack of the door, that amber aura, which had been pulsing with a restless, fierce magnetism, seemed to instinctively recoil the moment it sensed Charles. It immediately softened into fine, tender threads of light, attempting to gently and carefully curl around his ankles. Why didn't you let the driver pick you up? Garfield's massive frame blocked the light source. His husky voice was thick with suppressed exhaustion and deep anxiety. A place like Dice has no restrictions on alphas. An Omega like you. Are you having me followed? Charles whipped around, pressing his spine firmly against the wooden door. His chest heaved violently, his eyes burning with unshed tears. Every defense he had desperately built up flared to life in that instant. Dice's security is perfectly fine. I don't need you worrying about me. Charles, Garfield took a half-step forward. His usually sharp, stoic features now revealed a sliver of heartbreaking, almost pleading vulnerability. Garfield. Charles squeezed his eyes shut, forcing back the dampness. When he opened them again, only a resolute chill remained. He stared into the man's stunned, slightly constricted pupils, enunciating every word as if tearing his own heart apart in the process. Between us, to put it plainly, it's just a business partnership. I won't interfere with you, and I hope you won't cross the line either. Slam. The heavy wooden door was shut firmly between them. The last sliver of amber light leaking in was decisively cut off. Charles slid weakly down the doorframe, burying his face deeply into his trembling knees. Outside, the rejected amber glow seemed to completely lose its warmth, dissipating into a silent, drifting shower of gray ash. The neon lights of Dice Bar dragged out the hazy blur of 2:00 a.m. Inside VIP booth 202, a heavily intoxicated Charles had Alan pinned back against the velvet sofa, his pale fingers clumsily and forcefully tugging at the other man's shirt collar. "Let me see your neck. Why don't you have a scent anymore? Did an alpha claim you? Stop pulling! That hurts." Crash. The heavy door of the booth was suddenly shoved open with an undeniable force. The frenzied laser lights inside seemed to be instantly choked out, plunging the entire room into a suffocating silence. From beneath the pure black leather shoes at the entrance, a visible dark gold luminescence spread wildly across the carpet, like the formidable roots of an ancient tree, instantly drawing all the oxygen from the room. Garfield stood in the doorway, with a breathtaking, dominant intensity. His dark gaze was locked dead onto Charles' hand, which had just popped a button off Alan's shirt. The stormy, dark, gold fire surging in the man's eyes threatened to consume the entire booth in its overwhelming heat. The next second, the world spun around him. Charles didn't even know how he ended up being carried out of the club right in front of everyone. By the time he regained his senses, he was already sinking deeply into the massive king-sized bed in the master bedroom. Garfield stood at the edge of the bed, his distinctively sculpted hands slowly, methodically loosening the dark tie at his neck. His sharp jawline was tight with a fiercely magnetic tension. Charles instinctively shrank back toward the headboard, but the man's hand caught his ankle, pulling him back into the center of the bed with an undeniable, yet deeply restrained, firmness. "Now you know to be afraid." Garfield knelt one knee onto the mattress, his scorching lips pressing reverently, yet intensely, against each of Charles' trembling knuckles. As the man leaned closer, beams of tangible dark gold light surged into the air, weaving together like a beautiful, inescapable canopy that completely enveloped the bed from all sides. "What are you doing? Didn't we agree to live our own lives?" Charles breathed heavily, his eyes rimmed with red as he pushed back weakly against the overwhelming tide. The man's imposing shadow descended like an avalanche of warmth. Garfield's husky voice brushed against his ear, sparking a scorching shiver. "We are living our own lives. It's just that. You were playing around with models, while my only obsession is you." Clothes were pushed aside with a desperate fervor, revealing his collarbones. A dense shower of heavy, fiercely claiming kisses rained down. Charles trembled all over, instinctively tilting back his slender neck. Even biting his lower lip couldn't stop the soft, broken whimpers from escaping. In the darkness, countless midnight, blue orchid petals materialized out of thin air, blooming in the air with a stunning, fragile beauty. Yet in the very next second, they were completely wrapped, intertwined, and beautifully consumed by those dominant ribbons of dark, gold light. "Why are you crying, baby? We've barely even started. Bear with me, okay? Just for a moment, I promise." That night, the dark gold phenomenon utterly and passionately dissolved the midnight, blue petals, melting them together until the break of dawn. Several days of bed rest blurred into a fast-forward montage of Garfield bringing warm water and nourishment. It wasn't until a private evening gala days later that the brilliant crystal chandeliers once again illuminated Charles' slightly pale face. He had slipped away into the dessert section by himself. He had just picked up a small piece of cake with his fork when his older brother Keith's exasperated voice drifted over from behind him. "If nothing's wrong, why were you running off to Dice Bar every single night?" Charles puckered his lips, guiltily evading his brother's gaze as he poked at his plate. "I just went to hang out with Alan. I was afraid it'd only annoy Garfield if I stayed at home." Keith stared at him as if looking at a complete fool. "He finds you annoying? If he found you annoying, why would he practically beg our parents on his hands and knees to make this marriage happen?" Clatter. The sterling silver fork slipped from Charles' fingertips, crashing heavily onto the porcelain plate. He snapped his head up, his clear pupils trembling violently. "What? The marriage? Wasn't it because our family ran into a financial crisis and needed the Walton Group's help? The company is perfectly fine. Father's surgery was only postponed because the hospital overseas didn't have an available slot." Keith massaged his temples in sheer agony. "My silly little brother, did you really just conjure up a whole scenario in your head, take matters into your own hands, and offer yourself up as a sacrificial lamb to be married off?" Charles' brain instantly went into a state of total lockup. He took a rigid step backward, only to bump straight into a broad, warm chest. Turning around, he saw Garfield standing silently behind Keith, though he couldn't tell exactly when the man had arrived. On the carpet, a familiar, deeply restrained speck of dark gold light was quietly pulsing. Inside the Maybach on the drive home, a dead silence stretched through the cabin. Charles' fingers were tightly laced together over his knees, his knuckles a stark, unnatural white. Keith said the marriage was something Garfield had actively begged for. If that was true, why did he do it? Could it be that he actually liked him? But what about Brent? Did he or did he not have feelings for Brent? Right at that moment, Garfield turned his head. The dark gold aura around him, which usually carried such a dominant, commanding pressure, had turned incredibly soft. Like a cluster of timid fireflies, it reached out, testing the waters as it gently drifted over Charles' ice, cold fingertips. "Is there anything you want to say?" The man's tone still held that same intoxicating, comforting warmth. Charles looked at his deep, striking features, half hidden in the shifting shadows of the car. If this were before, he would have immediately jumped up and demanded to clear up this ridiculous misunderstanding. But now, listening to the deafening thud of his own heart hammering against his ribs, he discovered that he simply couldn't bring himself to let go. "Garfield?" Charles lowered his damp eyelashes, his voice trembling slightly in the dim cabin. "My mind is a bit of a mess right now. I need some time to think it over." The dark gold luminescence paused for a fraction of a second, then wrapped itself even more tenderly, even more tightly, around his shivering hand. "All right?" The quiet within the car was broken as the Maybach glided smoothly into the villa's driveway. After stepping out, however, Garfield abruptly stopped beneath the dim, casting shadows of the courtyard light. Within the man's deep eyes, those faint dark gold glimmers looked like shattered starlight, carrying a desperate, profoundly humble shred of hope. "No matter what decision you make, I will accept it. I'll wait for you." Yet, before the answer between the two of them could be revealed, Charles' sanity was completely shattered by a piercing, cool, toned photograph flashing on his phone screen. The cool glare of the display reflected off Charles' deathly pale face. In the photo, Brent's profile was visible, the corner of his mouth curving into a subtle, almost imperceptible smirk of victory. Behind him was Garfield, bare, chested with his back to the camera, in the middle of changing his shirt. The deep, defined contours of the man's spine looked agonizingly intimate under the stark white lighting. Slam. Charles slammed his hand onto the desk and bolted upright. He was no longer that docile, reclusive little artist. In this exact moment, the midnight, blue orchid scent at the nape of his neck materialized out of sheer fury into countless sharp, azure blades of wind, slicing wildly through the air of the art studio. Moving almost like a fleeting shadow, he rushed straight toward the Walton Group headquarters. In the top floor executive office, Brent was lounging elegantly on the deep gray leather sofa. The thin wisps of steam rising from his hot coffee were sliced into scattered fragments by the cold, structural architectural lines of the room. Looking up at Charles, who had just burst through the door with flushed, tear-rimmed eyes, he showed no surprise whatsoever. Instead, he gracefully set down his porcelain cup. "What is the meaning of this photo you sent me?" Charles stormed straight up to him. Because he was pushing his self-control to the absolute limit, his fingertips were shaking violently. Brent let out a soft, mocking chuckle, carrying that distinct, aloof coolness characteristic of an Omega who had spent a long time navigating an Alpha's domain. "It's an adult game. Everyone lives their own lives. Do you still not understand?" "I don't understand." Charles squeezed his eyes shut, fiercely suppressing the overwhelming sense of grievance that was about to erupt from his chest. When he opened his eyes again, an unprecedented, resolute fire had ignited within his pupils. Enunciating every single word, his voice echoed clearly across the entire office. "I only know that Garfield would absolutely never do anything to betray this marriage. I trust him." "Oh?" Brent arched an eyebrow playfully. "Even if it's just a business arrangement?" "Who said it's just a business arrangement?" Charles' voice cracked slightly with emotion, yet every word rang out with ironclad certainty, as if he were burning through a lifetime's worth of courage all at once. "We are going to spend the rest of our lives together. I love him. Who says I don't love him?" The moment the words left his lips, the dead silence of the office air was suddenly shattered by countless brilliant explosions of dark, gold light. The cold indifference on Brent's face seemed to melt away in a flash. He let out a sigh of relief, flashing a sly smile that looked a bit like someone whose playful trick had succeeded flawlessly, and gestured with his chin toward the space behind Charles. Charles turned around in sheer astonishment. Garfield was standing right in the doorway. The man's suppressed, dark, gold presence seemed to ignite in an instant, looking like a grand, silent display of fireworks blooming right behind him. The rims of his eyes were slightly red, and those eyes, which usually held the sharp, calculated edge of the business world, were now shining with a breathtaking, incandescent intensity, brimming with clusters of fierce, burning starlight. Brent stood up, casually patting Garfield on the shoulder with a hint of playful disdain in his tone. "All right, the favor I owed you is officially paid off. Next time you're trying to pursue someone, don't ask me to act out such a clumsy routine again." As Brent pushed open the door and left, the scene below the building seemed to transition into slow motion. Charles watched as that very same Brent, who had just seemed so arrogant and untouchable, threw himself straight into the arms of a tall man the moment he stepped outside. Their fingers locked together tightly, surrounded by a profound sense of certainty that could only come from years of devotion. "They've been legally married for a long time. Brent is my best assistant and the touchstone I brought in to test things." Garfield walked forward with slow, measured steps, pressing Charles back until his spine met the massive floor, to ceiling window. The lingering rays of the sunset dissolved the entire city into a river of liquid gold. The golden light filtered through the glass, spilling over the earnest, striking contours of the man's face. Garfield reached out with a trembling hand, gently cupping Charles' face. The man's palm was burning hot, his pupils reflecting Charles' startled, breathless expression. The surrounding air completely surrendered in that single moment as the amber currents of light and the midnight blue orchid petals intertwined, wrapped around one another, and finally melted together seamlessly without a single gap. "I'm sorry for letting you misunderstand for so long, Charles." Garfield lowered his head, resting his forehead gently against Charles, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that sounded like the prayer of the most devout believer. "The only person I have ever loved, from the very beginning to the very end, is you." The man dropped down onto one knee. Amidst that dark gold aura that felt like a galaxy pouring into the room, he looked up, his eyes filled with a profound sense of peace and happiness that Charles had never seen before. "It might be a little late, but would you marry me? Not for the stock prices, and not for the sake of our family's companies. Just for me, for Garfield." Looking down at the man who seemed to be entirely dissolving into the golden glow, Charles felt a sudden prickle of tears at the bridge of his nose, but the corners of his mouth finally curved upward. He nodded gently, slowly closing his eyes within that warm, amber tenderness simmered by the setting sun, stepping forward to meet that long, overdue kiss laced with the rich, comforting aroma of cedar wood. Extra chapter, the midsummer of his 18th year. Long, tedious family gatherings were fragmented into dappled pieces of shadow and light. Garfield absent-mindedly pulled a block from the bottom of the wooden tower, but his cool gaze cut through the noisy crowd, locking entirely onto the slender silhouette by the bookshelf. Charles stood at the very top of the stepladder, somewhat timidly flipping through an art book. A glimpse of his pale ankle was strikingly bright against the dark wood of the ladder. That was the very first time in Garfield's barren 18 years of life that the abstract concept of beautiful finally took on a concrete, breathtaking outline. Suddenly, the wheels at the base of the ladder let out a sharp screech. Charles' fragile frame lost its balance, tilting sharply backward. In that split second, Garfield's fingertips gave a nearly imperceptible tremble. Crash! The towering wooden block structure instantly collapsed. Facing the teasing laughter of his peers, Garfield casually brushed it off, claiming he was startled by the thunder. Yet, his entire heart and mind were completely tethered to the boy by the bookshelf. His jaw clenched, his very breath catching in his throat, as his gaze desperately followed the boy, who flailed in midair, before finally grabbing the handrail and letting out a long sigh of relief. It wasn't until he was absolutely certain that the delicate figure was safe that the deafening, frantic hammering in his chest finally began to subside. As the gathering dispersed, a torrential downpour began. A stark, blinding flash of lightning tore through the sky. Just as the thunder threatened to shatter his eardrums, a pair of soft, slightly cool palms suddenly covered Garfield's ears from behind, entirely without warning. The deafening roar was instantly muted. In its place, midnight, blue orchid petals bloomed out of thin air. Radiating a deeply comforting luminescence in the damp, chilly corridor, they tenderly wrapped around the 18-year-old boy, soothing his inherently fierce, dark, gold aura. Garfield turned his head, colliding with a pair of clear, deeply concerned eyes. That slender figure standing on his tiptoes, bathed in the midnight blue halo, carved himself permanently into Garfield's dreams for the next 7 years. When this long, sealed, fated connection was finally brought to light in their master bedroom after marriage, it earned Charles a bewildered, innocently flushed expression. To exact a sweet revenge on this incredibly forgetful little liar. For the entirety of that night, the soft midnight blue petals in the bedroom were endlessly, passionately intertwined and melted down by the dominant ribbons of dark gold light. It left Charles with red-rimmed eyes dissolving into breathless whimpers, never daring to dismiss the memory of their first meeting again. Rumble. A massive clap of thunder pulled Garfield back from his memories. The study door was pushed open. Charles, barefoot against the thick carpet, and with the faint flush of sleep still lingering at the corners of his eyes, hurried over and threw himself straight into Garfield's arms. The boy's soft palms urgently cupped his sharp, striking face. "It's thundering. Were you scared?" Garfield lowered his eyelashes, expertly masking the breathtakingly possessive glint in his eyes, and submissively tucked his chin into the crook of Charles' neck, nuzzling him gently. How could he possibly be afraid of thunder? But in this moment, the usually overwhelming dark, gold motes in the study were greedily yet obediently leaning toward Charles, entirely willing to let the midnight, blue luminescence wrap around them little by little. The night grew deep. Charles held the tall man tightly in his arms, his pale fingers rhythmically and gently patting his broad back. It wasn't until a steady, long rhythm of breathing came from his embrace that Garfield slowly opened his eyes. With infinite tenderness, he scooped up Charles' ankle, which had slipped out from under the covers, and tucked it securely back into the warmth of the blankets. Lowering his head, he pressed a deeply reverent kiss against the soft corner of the boy's lips. The rainstorm ceased, and the pristine moonlight poured like liquid silver over the beautifully rumpled bed. The dark, gold cedar dust and the midnight, blue orchid petals danced and intertwined in the moonlight, quietly sealing every heartbeat and all their hidden profound love within this incredibly tender summer night.
Finishing this story leaves such a comforting warmth in the heart. I absolutely adore these kinds of sweet, healing romances. I'm also incredibly glad that there wasn't a deliberately manufactured, toxic third-party drama in the plot. To be completely honest, when Brent first appeared, my heart was in my throat. I was terrified he might do something to hurt Charles, and even more afraid that he truly was that unforgettable childhood crush tucked away in Garfield's heart. I really don't enjoy those tropes where two brilliant Omegas are forced to fight over a single alpha. I much prefer seeing every wonderful, deserving person find their own perfect match. So, reaching the end and discovering that Brent was just putting on an act, playing the villain to test Charles' true feelings for Garfield, I let out the biggest sigh of relief. Charles is such a sensitive, deeply insecure sweetheart. Hez so used to wrapping himself in a protective shell of being rational and clear-headed. Faced with a sudden arranged marriage, he took the initiative to suggest living their own lives, even conjuring up a tragic self-sacrificing narrative for his family just to rationalize a union that lacked an emotional foundation. He appears so nonchalant and detached, but in reality his emotions are incredibly vulnerable to the world around him. When he realized he was falling in love, yet mistakenly believed Garfield's heart belonged to Brent, he didn't choose to communicate directly. Instead, he tried to mask his sour heartache and jealousy by moving into the guest room, deliberately coming home late, and hiding away in clubs. He was desperately trying to retreat back behind that safe, non-interference boundary. On the other hand, as a dominant alpha, Garfield is undeniably brilliant and incredibly patient. A 7-year secret crush has given him the composure to handle any unexpected curveball without batting an eye. When he realized Charles genuinely thought their marriage was purely for corporate gain, Garfield masterfully used stabilizing the stock price as an undeniable business excuse to openly demand Charles' company at the office. From there, he seamlessly and irrefutably claimed Charles' post, dinner strolls. Piece by piece, he quietly and effortlessly encroached upon Charles' private territory, slowly and gently warming the waters until Charles hopelessly fell for him. And finally, by using an outsider like Brent to trigger a much-needed sense of crisis, he successfully pushed Charles into willingly confessing his love. I have to say, Garfield is an absolute master strategist when it comes to romance. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next episode.